Hello, everybody. Hope you're doing well. Today I'm going to talk about Dr. Strangelove, or the full title, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb, a film from 1964, directed by Stanley Kubrick, starring Peter Sellers and George C. Scott, and Slim Pickens, Sterling Hayden, and many others in this Cold War satire. You could maybe debate whether this is a science fiction movie or not. It's a movie, I guess it's set in the present and when it was made in the early 1960s, but it does have a sci-fi scenario of technology going awry. So I guess in that case you could qualify Doctor Strangelove as a science fiction movie. Peter Sellers on the cover there as Doctor Strangelove, and you can see the war room there as well. So this film was directed by Stanley Kubrick. It was based on a novel by Peter George, I believe. I've never read the novel. I know it's called Red Alert that inspired the movie, but the original intention was for this movie to be a very serious thriller about a Cold War crisis, nuclear crisis during the Cold War. And Kubrick, as he became known for, did tons of reading, tons of research on the subject. And the more he read, the more depressed he got about how actually depressing this subject matter was. But also he became aware of how technical glitches in the technology could lead to a catastrophe as well, and that's what the movie's about. So, and eventually it got so grim that it started to be funny, where Kubrick and his screenwriters, he brought in Terry Southern, who was a known comedy writer. These situations got to be so absurd, they got to be funny. So what we get is a very dark comedy about the Cold War. I should say this film came out in the early 60s, where fears of nuclear war were everywhere in the culture. You had this, we're into the Kennedy years now, and you had the Berlin crisis during the 61-62 between the Soviet Union and the United States, which was very tense. And then you had the Cuban Missile Crisis in October of 1962, which got really, really intense and almost led to a war, a catastrophe. Luckily, cool heads prevailed in that crisis. But so the fear of nuclear war was real. Kubrick famously was a New Yorker, and he was especially worried because knowing that New York would definitely be a target if it ever came to that. So Kubrick takes a comedic approach to it. Now, the plot of the film is pretty simple. The Strategic Air Command, which were planes, their job was to patrol the skies and be on call if need be to deliver the bombs if those orders came through. And the film starts out where a crew on a bomber gets the orders to attack. Okay, now it turns out these orders were sent by a general who had completely lost his mind, General Jack D. Ripper, played by Sterling Hayden, who is a extremely paranoid about communism. He's obsessed with the water being fluoridated, and he's got some serious psychological problems. So he's taken upon himself to launch an attack on the Soviet Union. Okay, so this is a scenario. What if you have a mentally unbalanced person who orders such a thing? So the plot of the movie is about how do they get out of this situation? How do they stop the planes from bombing the Soviet Union? And this leads to the war room sequences. And really, there's really three parallel stories happening in the movie, with whether we're on the plane, the bomber with the crew, or we're in the war room with the president and the generals and the diplomats, and with General Ripper and what in his odd ramblings during this crisis that's going on. I mentioned Peter Sellers plays three characters. He plays Captain Mandrake, who is a British liaison officer, who is, I guess, an aide to Jack Ripper, who he's trying to talk sense to. And Sellers also plays the President of the United States. And he plays the German scientist Dr. Strangelove, the iconic character in the film. So it's a remarkable feat of acting by Peter Sellers. And once we get into the war room and the leaders are trying to figure out what to do about the crisis, this is some of the greatest satire ever made, just about nuclear war, about diplomacy, about politics, all these things. The president, played by Sellers, is loosely based on Adlai Stevenson. I know, a famous Democratic candidate for president, who was always kind of perceived as being maybe weak on national defense. And you have the generals, who are very hawk-like, trying to push the president into a war. George C. Scott among them, who is kind of a little crazy himself, and doesn't seem too upset about the prospect of war. So you have that going on, and there's so many famous scenes, exchanges in this film about just the use of language, lines like "there's no fighting in the war room," and the Peter Sellers phone conversation with the Soviet premier is a great feat of comedy. Which, one thing I learned watching this, someone pointed out that a lot of that's a very famous scene, and some of it's inspired by Bob Newhart, who made the phone comedy where you're talking on the phone to someone and make a comedy bit out of it. But apparently Newhart took that from some other comedians as well. So that's interesting. But anyway, that's a very famous scene, the president's phone call with the premier, and as they try to talk their way through this very absurd situation. And we're also on the bomber plane. Slim Pickens, famous actor who plays the leader of the squadron on this plane, and there's a lot of great, as this raging Texan who's ready to go bomb the Soviets. So the language play in the movie is great. The use of symbolism in the film. I mean, this is a movie. It's a critique of, to use today's terms, toxic masculinity, about a bunch of men and their insecurities, and how does that play out in a nuclear world where men, primarily men at this time, have the power to press the button and really destroy the world, destroy civilization. And how do the insecurities of men, whether there's so much sexual symbolism in this film. On almost every scene you can see visually. The opening credit sequence has a lot of symbolism of sexuality in it. So that's just there. Sometimes it's subtle, sometimes it's not so subtle, but that's definitely there through the film. But also just mentally unbalanced people who don't really belong in these positions of very high responsibility, and the concerns there. And the set pieces are great. The sets are very famous in this film, whether it's the war room is very famous, or the way Kubrick uses space in this film is interesting. And even though, like I said, it's almost like a stage play. I mean, you could almost listen to this movie as a radio play because of the dialogue, but Kubrick visually makes it very interesting all the way through the entire film. So visually it's great. The cinematography is iconic. And just a few other things to say. The acting, I've mentioned the performances. Peter Sellers is famously one of the greatest of all time in this film. And yeah, and the dark comedy and all that is, what else can you say? It's there. Now, this film was viewed at the time as it was a popular film at the time. I know it offended some people because it was very critical of power structures, but as you go further into the 60s and the Vietnam War, and even further in the 70s with Watergate, I think this film kind of grew in relevance just at the idea of having people in high places of power who are either corrupt or mentally incompetent or mentally, you know, crazy, just flat out crazy. I don't know how this film plays in 2025. I'm sure we could have a lot to say about that. But like I said, the idea of someone in a fit of emotion, in a fit of, you know, having a bad day and just making a very catastrophic decision is there in our world. And the threat of nuclear war was so much a part of the culture of the 60s, early 60s. It kind of had a revival in the 1980s when there was definitely a Cold War tensions were once again at a fever pitch. But in a lot of ways, I think the world we live in today is even more dangerous than those times where there's been nuclear proliferation. Other more and more countries are getting nuclear weapons, and it's more complicated now. In many ways, it's more frightening now. And yet it's something, and yet people, I think, deal with it. This was pointed out by someone that it's just not talked about, and just no one really talks about it anymore. We hear about other threats like climate is a big concern, no doubt about it, but the immediate threat of nuclear weapons kind of remains just something that's almost repressed these days. Something, unless it's a case where people think it's a Cold War thing, it's part of history. Especially watching this movie, I think showing it to younger people, it may feel like just a distant time in history that we've moved on from. But in many ways, we haven't moved on at all. In some ways, we've taken a few steps backward from the time that this movie was made. So yeah, just some thoughts there. But I think it's the writing, the acting, the script. It's pretty close to a perfect movie, and essential if you want to understand the time period. But also gives us a lot to think about as far as what's happening these days and global politics and in the world at large. So yeah, Dr. Strangelove, classic film. Thanks for watching, and I will talk to you later.